Here you can learn about me, how I have handled and am handling being diagnosed with a brain tumour, and my discoveries about cancer specifically and health in general. My name is Peter Beaton, and I believe that if you're not willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then no one can really help you. But if you are willing to teach yourself and learn about your own body and your own health, then no one can stop you. I was diagnosed with a grade 4 glioma in July 2021 and had it successfully operated on in August 2021. The trick after that is to stop it from coming back. Standard of care is for radiotherapy and chemotherapy. I have elected not to have either of those therapies. Even with them, the chance of surviving 2.5 years is 50% and the chance of surviving 5 years is 10%. And even then, the surviving years are marred by the side effects of the actual treatment. My belief is that mainstream medical understanding of cancer is fundamentally flawed. Instead of the mainstream view that cancer is caused by excess growth or is caused by genetic abnormalities, my view is that cancer is fundamentally caused by damage to the metabolic machinery of the cells in question, which then leads to genetic damage and leads to excessive growth. But these things result from the metabolic damage. They are not the actual underlying cause of the cancer in the first place. If you don't get the fundamental cause correct, your approach to treating or preventing it will never be properly successful. Almost all cells in our bodies generate energy from outside sources, which is metabolism. They generate that in the mitochondria of our cells. Mitochondria exist, usually in their hundreds, inside pretty much every cell in our body. The outside sources that the mitochondria use are, in humans, oxygen, number one, and number two, the glucose or fats or proteins from the food that we consume. Our mitochondria then combine the oxygen that we breathe with glucose or fats or proteins in reactions that produce energy. Technically, they produce an energy-rich molecule called ATP, which can then be used elsewhere in the cell to do work. All work in every single cell in the body relies completely on this energy-rich ATP molecule. No ATP, no life. All mitochondria can work with either glucose from carbohydrates in our diet, or from fats or from proteins from our diet. But the mitochondria are especially good at converting oxygen and glucose into energy, i.e. into ATP, high energy molecules. The mitochondria are so good at converting glucose into ATP that it was the evolution of mitochondria into our cells in the first place about 2 billion years ago that first allowed multicellular life to be possible. So no mitochondria, no animals, no plants, no organisms other than single-celled bacteria. So, since the mitochondria are so efficient at converting glucose into ATP high-energy molecules, it follows that we don't need very much glucose in the first place. A little glucose in the mitochondria is converted very efficiently into all the ATP high-energy molecules that the cell and thus the body requires. In the cancer cell, however, the mitochondria are damaged. How that happens is for another video, but it is true that in practically every single type of cancer, the mitochondria are damaged. Breast cancer, prostate cancer, brain cancer, colon cancer, literally all major cancers have this common feature, that their mitochondria are damaged. The consequence of this is that in order to get the correct amount of ATP, high energy molecules that the cell requires, the cancer cell cannot use its efficient mitochondria that are now damaged, and it has to rely on a different, inefficient way of converting glucose into ATP high energy molecules. This process is called fermentation. This does not use oxygen. But since it is inefficient, it therefore needs a lot of glucose to make enough ATP high energy molecules for the cancer cell to survive. The logical conclusion of this is that cancer cells love glucose. They love high levels of glucose in the blood, since that is how the glucose gets into the cell. Glucose is basically food for cancer. It is fertilizer for cancer cells. So cancer cells with the damaged mitochondria that cannot combine oxygen and glucose effectively are super hungry for glucose. Our body does naturally make a small amount of glucose from other things that we eat, proteins and fats. It makes that in the liver. Not very much glucose is made, just enough to allow the few cells in the body that do not have mitochondria to survive. Probably not enough for the vast majority of cancer cells to survive, since these cancer cells need a lot of glucose. So the first step in trying to target cancer of any type is to reduce the amount of sugar that is available for it to survive. The only two sources of glucose that a cancer cell has available to it are A, the small amount of glucose that the liver naturally produces, and B, the carbohydrates that we eat. Carbohydrates are, by definition, glucose molecules attached to other glucose molecules. One glucose molecule on its own is simply glucose. Two glucose molecules attached to each other is maltose. Several hundred glucose molecules linked together could be a vegetable. Several thousand linked glucose molecules could be wood. One of the jobs of our digestive system is to break down the carbohydrates that we eat into single molecules of glucose, which can then be absorbed into the bloodstream through the gut wall. Therefore, the fewer glucose molecules that are attached to each other in the food that we eat, the more quickly our gut will break them apart to end up with pure glucose, which can then be absorbed into the bloodstream and end up feeding the cancer cell that is super hungry for that glucose in order to survive and prosper. Modern diets are full of highly processed carbohydrates like bread, cakes, biscuits, refined rice, etc., etc. All processed carbohydrates are short chains of glucose which are quickly broken down by the gut into pure glucose, which is then absorbed into the bloodstream and will feed any cancer. Therefore, the absolutely first, simplest and most basic approach to surviving any cancer is to reduce the amount of carbohydrates in your diet, most especially modern processed carbohydrates. How low carb can you go? The lower the better. The lower you go, the less blood glucose there is to feed your glucose-hungry cancer. There is no lower limit for carbohydrates, unlike proteins and fats. Both proteins and fats in the diet are required for life. There are certain proteins and certain fats that the body cannot manufacture for itself and therefore must come from what we eat. These are called essential proteins and essential fats. However, there is no such thing as an essential carbohydrate. If one was to eat zero carbohydrates, the liver would still make the correct amount of blood glucose that it needs from the proteins and fats that you ate. So that's my big point that I want to make in this video. Blood sugar is your enemy if you have cancer or if you are at risk of developing it. There are several ways of reducing blood sugar, but the first step is always to stop eating foods that our gut converts into blood sugar and blood glucose easily. If you or a loved one has cancer, I know exactly how you feel. I'm not a doctor, I'm not giving medical advice, I'm simply sharing knowledge that I believe can help you know and understand that there are lots of practical things that you can do for yourself or your loved one to help you get over this thing, over and above what the mainstream medical system can offer. Hope is not a strategy, but learning, researching, actively helping yourself and not just taking even a doctor's advice without critically thinking for yourself certainly is. If you want to do one further thing to help you understand and cope with cancer, please buy and read a recently published book on the subject by a brilliant Canadian hospital consultant called Jason Fung. The book is called The Cancer Code.